There is a kind of fossil that most people carry without ever noticing it. It does not sit in a museum. It does not require a shovel or a laboratory. It sits quietly at the end of your own name, passed down through generations, worn smooth by time, until it feels like nothing more than a label. But for a certain kind of surname, that label is not random. It is a record, a compressed, 600-year-old transmission from an ancestor who once stood on a dock, or a deck, or a quay wall, doing work that helped move the world's goods, people, and ambitions across open water. Some names remember a trade. Some remember a rank. Some remember a river crossing, a harbor town, or a voyage that never should have succeeded but did. And once you know how to read them, ordinary surnames start to look like something else entirely: coordinates, pointing back toward a moment when someone's daily labor helped stitch together the earliest versions of a connected world. This is a story about 12 of those names. Not a story about titles of nobility, and not a story about famous men alone. It is a story about the working architecture of maritime history. The coopers, the pilots, the shipwrights, the mariners, and about how their names survived, migrated, and multiplied long after the ships themselves rotted at anchor. For most of the last 2 centuries, the standard explanation for a surname was treated as settled. Genealogists would open a record, find an occupational or place-based name, and file it under a simple heading: this family did that job, or this family came from that place. Cooper meant barrel maker. Fisher meant someone who fished. Wright meant builder. Case closed, mystery filed away. That explanation was not wrong. It was just incomplete. Because a surname is not simply a word. It is a social technology, invented in most of Western Europe, sometime between the 11th and 15th centuries, precisely because populations were growing and trading fast enough that first names alone could no longer keep people straight. And the surnames that stuck hardest, that spread furthest, that got copied into the most parish registers and ship manifests, were disproportionately the ones tied to something economically important. In coastal Europe, almost nothing was more economically important than the sea. So when historians started mapping where certain surnames clustered, the first friction appeared quickly. Names like Cooper and Fisher were not evenly distributed across inland farming villages and coastal ports. They piled up again and again in harbor towns, river-mouth settlements, and shipping lanes. A name that was supposedly just descriptive of one man's job was showing up with a strange kind of geographic gravity, as if the job itself had been anchored to specific stretches of coastline for centuries. That was the first crack in the simple story. The second crack came from something almost nobody expects a surname to reveal: biology. In the 1990s and 2000s, population geneticists began asking an unusual question. In cultures where surnames pass from father to son, does the surname behave anything like the Y chromosome, which also passes almost unchanged from father to son? The two systems, one cultural, one genetic, were invented independently, thousands of years apart, for completely different reasons. And yet they follow the same line of inheritance. Researchers studying British and Irish populations found that men sharing a surname were significantly more likely to share closely related Y chromosome types than men chosen at random, especially for rarer surnames with a single point of origin. In other words, a surname was not just a label. In many cases, it was tracking something real underneath it, a genuine, biological male line stretching back toward a founding ancestor. That did not mean every bearer of a name descended from one man. Adoption, remarriage, name changes, and what genealogists delicately call non-paternity events all introduced static into the signal. But the static did not erase the pattern. It only complicated it, the way a long exposure photograph blurs but still shows a shape. If you are drawn to this kind of hidden history detective work, this is exactly the terrain where genetic genealogy and traditional archival research meet. And it's worth sticking around, because the 12 names ahead are where that terrain gets genuinely strange. What emerged from this convergence of archives and DNA was not one clean story, but several competing explanations for how maritime surnames actually formed and spread. The first explanation is the simplest: direct occupational naming. A man worked as a ship's cooper, sealing barrels of salted fish, wine, or gunpowder tight enough to survive an ocean crossing, and eventually the trade became the family's permanent identifier. The second is migration-driven surname transplantation. As trading empires expanded, families did not just export goods, they exported names. A surname rooted in one harbor town could appear, a century later, in a colonial port thousands of miles away, carried not by a single traveler but by successive waves of merchants, sailors, and settlers following established trade routes. The third is a more layered idea: occupational surnames as absorption points. In smaller ports, entire extended households, including apprentices, in-laws, and unrelated workers who took on a master's trade name informally, sometimes ended up folded under one surname, even without a direct biological connection. The name spread faster than any single bloodline could explain, because in a working harbor, identity and occupation were often inseparable. No single framework fully explains all 12 names on this list. That is, in itself, the point. Maritime surnames were not created by one tidy mechanism. They were created by centuries of overlapping forces, labor, geography, trade, and inheritance, all pulling in the same general direction, toward the water. With that foundation laid, here is where the individual names begin to speak. Cooper is one of the oldest and most widespread occupational surnames in the English-speaking world, and its maritime importance is easy to underestimate. Long before refrigeration, an ocean voyage lived or died by its barrels. Salted meat, fresh water, wine, gunpowder, all of it depended on watertight casks built by skilled coopers. Port cities needed coopers constantly, and the trade became hereditary in many families, which helps explain why the surname clusters so heavily in old shipping and shipbuilding regions of England, the Netherlands, and their former colonies. Fisher carries a more literal meaning, but its history is anything but simple. In medieval coastal Europe, fishing was not a side occupation, it was a formal, often heavily regulated trade tied directly into regional and international commerce, especially as salted and dried fish became one of the most tradable commodities in the medieval economy. Families named Fisher were frequently embedded in networks that supplied ships, markets, and eventually transatlantic trade routes, not just local dinner tables. Mariner, and its close relative mariner, is about as direct as a surname gets. It comes straight from the medieval term for a sailor, someone whose entire livelihood was built on the deck of a ship. Unlike many occupational surnames, mariner rarely detached from its original meaning, which is part of why genealogists treat it as one of the clearest linguistic fossils of a working seafaring ancestor. Waterman initially sounds vague, but in its historical context it was extremely specific. A waterman operated small craft, ferrying goods and passengers along rivers and harbor mouths that fed larger maritime trade networks. In cities like London, watermen formed powerful guilds, controlling who could legally move people and cargo across the water. The surname often marks a family that sat at the critical connective tissue between inland trade and open sea shipping. Wright, particularly in its compound form shipwright, points toward one of the most physically demanding and economically vital maritime trades of all: the builders. A shipwright did not simply hammer boards together. Shipwrights designed hulls capable of surviving open ocean, and their skill directly determined whether a trading voyage, or an entire colonial expedition, would succeed or vanish beneath the waves. If names like these are starting to feel personal, it might be worth pausing here to look into your own family's surname history, because sometimes the clue was never hidden. It was just waiting to be asked about. Skipper is a surname with a slightly more unusual path. Derived from the Dutch and Low German word for a ship's captain, it entered English-speaking regions through centuries of trade contact across the North Sea. Its presence in a family tree can sometimes hint at ancestral connections to Dutch, Flemish, or Baltic shipping networks that were deeply intertwined with English and Scottish ports for hundreds of years. Sawyer, at first glance, seems purely inland, someone who cuts timber. But in coastal shipbuilding regions, sawyers were essential to the maritime economy in a very direct way. Cutting and shaping the enormous quantities of timber needed for hulls, masts, and dockyards was a specialized, physically brutal trade, and sawyer families frequently lived and worked within sight of the shipyards that depended on them. Cabot occupies a different category entirely. A surname whose maritime identity is tied less to a trade and more to a specific, documented voyage. Believed to derive from an Italian route associated with coastal navigation, the name became permanently linked to transatlantic exploration through the recorded voyages credited to the Cabot family in the late 15th century. Families carrying this name today, particularly in parts of England and its former colonies, sit at the intersection of trade, exploration, and the earliest European contact with North America's eastern coastline. Hudson tells a similarly layered story. As a patronymic surname, meaning, essentially, son of Hudda, it existed long before any famous voyage. But its association with a documented and consequential search for a northern trade route to Asia permanently attached the name to exploration history, and to a river and bay that still carry it today. Genealogically, the surname's spread illustrates how a single high-profile voyage could elevate an already existing family name into something historians would trace for centuries. Drake is one of the more debated names on this list, and its ambiguity is part of what makes it instructive. Linguists trace it to Old English roots connected to either a nickname meaning dragon, or, in some regional cases, to duck-keeping. Its later, powerful association with English naval and privateering history during the age of transatlantic trade shows how a name's meaning can shift dramatically depending on which century and which family branch you are following. Not every maritime name began at sea, some arrived there. Nelson, another patronymic surname meaning son of Neil, followed a comparable path. Common across England, Scotland, and Ireland for centuries before any naval association existed, it became permanently linked to maritime command through documented naval history in the Age of Sail. Its story is a useful reminder that a surname's earliest meaning and its later cultural weight are not always the same thing. Sometimes history adds a second layer on top of the first. Cartier, rooted in the French word for a carter or transporter of goods, illustrates how an inland trade name could become permanently maritime through documented exploration and mapping expeditions along the North American coastline and the St. Lawrence River. Families carrying variations of this name across French-speaking trading and colonial regions often trace back to communities whose economic identity was built around the movement of goods, first over land and eventually by ship. Taken together, these 12 names do not tell one clean story. They tell 12 overlapping ones: trades, migrations, single documented voyages, guild memberships, river crossings, and patronymic accidents that happen to intersect with the sea. Some names were maritime from their very first recorded use. Others arrived at the coast only later, carried there by ambition, trade, or a single consequential decision made by one ancestor centuries ago. What connects them is not a shared origin, but a shared exposure to something enormous, the earliest version of a connected global economy, built not by empires alone, but by coopers sealing barrels, watermen rowing goods to harbor, and sawyers shaping the timber that would eventually cross an ocean. If names like these are the kind of hidden history that pulls you in, it's worth staying close. Because the deeper you look into ordinary surnames, the more the past stops feeling distant and starts feeling astonishingly specific. Picture, for a moment, a harbor at dawn in the 15th or 16th century. Fog sitting low over gray water. The creak of rope against wood. Men moving barrels down a stone quay, their breath visible in the cold, none of them aware that the trade they were practicing that morning would still be legible, faintly, in the names of strangers born 500 years later on continents they had never heard of. There was no ceremony to it. No one stood at that harbor imagining a family line stretching into an unimaginable future. They were simply doing the work in front of them, coiling rope, cutting timber, guiding a small boat between a larger ship and the shore. And yet the work outlived the workers. It became a word. The word became a name. The name became a thread, thin but unbroken, running from that fog-covered dock straight into modern family trees, DNA databases, and immigration records on the other side of an ocean those ancestors could barely have imagined crossing. This is, in the end, the real discovery hiding inside maritime surnames. Not that a handful of names happen to sound nautical, but that ordinary language, the plainest, most utilitarian words for jobs and rivers and boats, turned out to be one of history's most durable record-keeping systems. No parchment required. No monument needed. Just a name, repeated at enough baptisms and enough ship manifests, until it became too embedded to disappear. The old assumption was that a surname was simply a label, fixed and flat, telling you almost nothing beyond a single ancestor's occupation. The evidence suggests something larger and more alive. A surname can be a compressed migration record, a guild membership, a river crossing, a single documented voyage that reshaped a family's identity for 5 centuries afterward. It can carry the imprint of trade routes that connected continents long before anyone used that word. The map of who built the earliest trading and exploration networks was never going to be found only in the biographies of famous captains. It was always going to be found, at least in part, in the ordinary names carried by the coopers, the fishers, the watermen, and the shipwrights who made those voyages physically possible, and who, without ever intending to, left their names as coordinates for anyone patient enough to read them.